All right, we're officially recording our first episode. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this brand new podcast, the Scientific Outdoorsman. So this podcast is three dudes that are really into science, and we decided that we should put together a podcast to see if we can use science to better understand wildlife and how that might be able to make us better hunters and fishermen. So before we get too far into it, let's do a quick little round of intros. So my name's Mark Barton. I'm a PhD ecologist in South Florida, and I'm focused on food web and community ecology, and I currently work for a state agency. Then down here on the bottom, we got Cody.
I'm Cody. I'm a PhD candidate, hopefully finishing up in the next year or so. In the next year. You know how those things
That's how it goes, yeah. I said that for 2 years.
Yeah. So I most of my work is centered around movement ecology of coastal fish in the Everglades. I am trying to incorporate some trophic stuff using stable isotopes and some other prey community assemblage aspects. But yeah, that's me. Hopefully finishing up here.
I think I literally wrote the exact same thing you just said in my notes. I guess I summarized it.
You know me pretty well.
Matt.
Yeah, if you can't tell from my background, I'm also a fish nerd. I also have my PhD, so I'm going to mark there. And also similarly did a lot of stuff with movement and looking at food webs. So how do the different prey and predator species within, for me, freshwater systems, especially lakes, how do they all interact? And I'm currently in Colorado, so getting up nice and early for this, but my position is based out of University of Vermont.
Sweet. So basically, we all have the same background. It's like all I had to say: fish.
I'm freshwater, they're marine. That's one of the differences.
I'm freshwater too, man. I worked in the Everglades.
Oh, that's true.
The real Everglades, like not that brackish stuff.
Cool coastal
stuff. Anyway, so probably that little intro right there probably gave you guys a hint towards this, but we have a couple things in common, and one of them is that we're all nerds. And the other is that we all love hunting and fishing. And that's kind of like how we kind of became friends. And so with that in mind, this podcast, every single episode, we're going to be picking out a single peer-reviewed journal article. That's just a fancy way of saying a scientific paper. And we're going to be walking the listeners through the science that was used, what the researchers found, and then my favorite part is how you can then use that information to make yourself a better hunter or fisherman. At the end of every podcast, we're going to make sure that those papers that we discussed are going to be downloadable for you guys. So check out down into the description here. There's going to be a link. You guys can find all the papers there if you want to get into more detail about what we've been talking about. Before we dive into this paper, a couple of big announcements. Today is actually election day, and there's a couple of things that some folks can be voting on in Florida and Colorado, and I'm sure there's some in other states, but these are just the ones that are on the top of our minds. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to those. If you live in Florida, Amendment 2, the right to hunt and fish. This is an amendment that supports science-based management, and it puts the power to manage and regulate wildlife where it should be, and that is with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And this amendment would give constitutional support to use defensible science to make decisions, as opposed to using crazy emotional rhetoric that's often presented by anti-conservationist environmentalists. And yes, I said anti-conservationist environmentalists because environmentalism is not the same thing as conservationism, but we can dive into that another day. And then, Matt, do you want to talk about Amendment
Prop
Colorado?
Prop 127?
Colorado?
Yeah, so especially those folks living here in Colorado, I'm sure you've heard of Proposition 127. It's received millions of dollars in campaigning from both both sides of it, both those for and against it. And Prop 127 is talking about banning hunting on mountain lions, bobcats, and lynx. Lynx are already federally endangered, so we can't hunt them here anyways. But there was an organization that came through and didn't like the way that people are hunting mountain lions, using dogs and chasing them, and having bobcats being kind of sold for their fur rather than being used primarily for consumption. So they're trying to get rid of those hunting efforts, even though those populations science is showing that, those populations are stable, if not increasing, even with hunting pressure in place. And so similarly, trying to have conservation organizations that are keeping track of these populations and maintaining by hunting, which has been working, really well. Proposition 127 is going to end that and have just complete ban on hunting for all three of those species. So that's something that's been high on the mind of a lot of the hunters and anglers out in this area, just because, it's not only is it, it's something that the hunters have been doing for tradition, but it's really important for conservation and keeping those populations stable.
So with that said, if you're in Colorado, vote no on Amendment 4. And if you're in Florida,
127.
Oh, I thought it was
Proposition 127.
Proposition 127. Sorry, my bad. Vote no on that. And if you're in Florida, vote yes on Amendment 2. And I think that the two of these happening simultaneously is like a really good example of exactly what we're trying to prevent in Florida. Because what's happening in Colorado right now with this proposition is literally an emotion-based management move, right? There's people that are going, oh, we don't like the way that you hunt because these animals are too cute or whatever, and they're trying to push the managers to stop hunting, even though there's no science to support that decision. So hopefully we can prevent this kind of stuff from happening in Florida by passing Amendment 2. Anyway, we won't harp on it any longer. Matt, you wanted to make a quick plug for your calendars. He's selling calendars with with pictures of sweaty dudes, I think, right?
I think there's some sweaty females in there too. Yeah, all sorts of sweaty people. But so I'm starting up a chapter of the National Wild Turkey Federation and NWTF here in Western Colorado. It's specific for Montrose, Colorado, just south of Grand Junction. These are some pretty slick calendars, so it's nice. They're only $50, but every week you get entered into a raffle for different guns, and so they're doing them in 1,000 group batches. So every week you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of getting a gun. It's $50. If you have any interest, definitely get in touch with me. $35 from that goes towards your membership for the next year, and hopefully we'll be able to help out this organization. A lot of what the NWTF does is conservation based, so the funding that goes into the federation funds all sorts of different conservation projects from the local level to the national level. It's a really great organization. Turkey hunting is a ton of fun. I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the spring. But reach out if you'd be interested in a calendar.
How do you want people to reach out to you if they want a calendar?
So we have a email, scientificoutdoorsman@gmail.com. That would probably be that'll probably be the best way to reach out, and be able to find that in details below.
Yeah, I'll drop that in the description here. By the way, I have a friend of mine from Colorado, and he told me that the proper way to say the city you live in,
Colorado.
No, Montrose, not Montrose. And he said that if you're from Montrose and you say it the right way, that all the old timers at the gas stations will just start telling you all the best places to hunt, because they'll know that you're like an OG, Montroser, and that you're not like, a newbie. So maybe if there's someone from Colorado listening, they'll have something to say about that. All right. Oh, that was probably super loud. Sorry, everybody. Let's get into this podcast. All right. So Cody, you picked out this paper. Why don't you do a quick little intro here? I can share the screen so you so everybody kind of see what we're talking. Oh, that's crazy. Here we go. All right, this is the paper right here. Take it away, Cody.
All right. Yeah, so we are in Alabama, looking at how hunting pressure or how deer respond behaviorally to hunting pressure pre-rut, which is pretty key. A lot of papers don't have the opportunity, a lot of research doesn't actually get the opportunity to study deer responding to predation. Here it's hunting pressure before the rut. So they're truly acting, or they're acting more naturally. They're not
driven by sex.
Fired up about other stuff.
And that was a really cool thing about the paper too. That's why they picked Alabama, because the Alabama hunting season is so long that they could actually do this.
Yeah, they have like 5 different rut timelines or something in Alabama. It's something crazy like that.
It's kind of the same here in Florida. We have rut happening all the way from July through like February.
Yeah,
that's nuts.
So yeah, they radio tagged or GPS collared some deer, about 30 of them in the end, and then measured they measured their movements and came up with these movement metrics that assessed how they're moving throughout the week based on how much hunting pressure was happening in private lands and then 2 public lands.
Yeah, and also the pieces of land that they did this on, I have the numbers here. The private lands were 8,000 and 12,000 acres, and then the public land was 28 and 44,000 acres. But I thought it was also important to mention that one of each of those was in the coastal plains type habitat, and one of each was in the Appalachian Mountains. So 2 different habitat types to get a little bit of heterogeneity in there.
Also talking about, having some variance or some differences in what they're looking at. They're really looking at this from a perspective of, bucks and does, and then also immature and mature deer. And they were calling immature deer 1.5 and 2.5 year olds, and then mature deer anything older than 3.5, to see, if you're an older, wiser deer, does that have any influence on how you're going to respond to the hunting pressure?
And spoiler alert, I think the results are pretty darn cool.
Yeah. Pretty clear too.
Yeah.
Right.
Should I get into results then? Anything we missed?
I think before we dive into the results, I think we should break down like what some of the variables are that they included. So, the hunting.
I just want to give a little bit more background too before we get into those variables. Just because I was really interested in knowing like what was the hunting pressure that was going on, and so even though there was bow season that started before the study, they were just really looking at the rifle season, making a lot of noise in the woods. And they were studying the deer for about, anywhere from, I think it said about 3 weeks up to, it was about 6 weeks. Actually, no, it was a little bit more than that. I think it was about 8 weeks. Yeah, about 8 weeks. And that was all based on when did the rut start in the season or in one of these locations. So from the beginning of rifle season until the rut. And even though it was mostly the rifle season, archery season might have already been going on for a few weeks based on where this different part of the study was going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the deer are already kind of feeling a little bit of pressure from that.
Right.
But I mean, personally, I've always noticed like during archery season, there's just so much less people in the woods. The deer haven't fully responded yet. And that kind of gets into something they brought up in the discussion about like how it is that the deer start to respond, whether it's like they just feel the presence or hear, trucks and stuff moving through, or whether it was like individual interactions. And then they were basically postulating that it's interactions like directly with hunters that are causing deer to make changes. So, but yeah, as you guys can probably imagine, the hunting pressure is obviously going to be greater during daylight hours because you can't hunt at nighttime, and on weekends. And so the way they split up those time variables, the temporal variables, they had day type, which would be weekend versus weekday, but they also looked at it at a finer scale, looking at it at each day of the week. And then they obviously looked at daytime and nighttime movement. And then the way that they measured the movements, they were looking at continuous movements that the deer were making. So like every time a deer would stop moving for several consecutive timestamps, which was they were taking a GPS location every hour. So if they stopped moving, then the next time they moved would be like a new movement again. And so by looking at each of those movements, they were looking at how fast they were moving, so the distance they traveled per hour during daytime and nighttime hours. They looked at the net displacement, which was how far they moved from their starting point. Then they also calculated the probability of activity. So like the probability that a deer is going to make a movement greater than 50 meters or 50 yards approximately. And then finally, the last variable they looked at was the temporal selection. And this was basically whether a deer preferred to move during the day or nighttime. And they did that for like Matt was saying, the different ages and the different times of day. And so those are some of the things we're going to look at. And then before we dive into the results, there was three things I wrote down that I thought were kind of important caveats to keep in mind. And Cody, you already touched on one, the fact that this study was done before the rut. And that really allows them to tease apart these movements without having that influence of sexy time. Because let's be real, when sexy time is on the table, like we do stupid things, like we become like there's no way to predict it. And I guess that's part of the reason people love hunting the rut, is because anything can happen, but that makes it really hard to tease us apart. And previous studies have tried to do it during the rut and failed to find these relationships because of that. And then the area that they did this study in had minimal non-human predators. So the humans were really the only ones that were influencing the deer as predators. There was coyotes on these properties, but coyotes really are only killing baby deer. And they did mention that a previous study found no predation events on deer in these areas. So yeah, humans were the only ones affecting them. And then this one, I didn't like this one, but I kind of understand why they did this. The movement events that they used for these analyses, they only used movements that started and ended during the day or started and ended at night. So any of the ones that crossed over from day to night or the other way around, they didn't use, which I don't like, because that's usually when deer are moving. Like I think a lot more of the movements are happening at that time, but I also understand that they had to figure out some way to differentiate between daytime and nighttime. So just keep that in mind as we're going through some of these results.
And they also, their daytime was defined as like the legal hunting hours. So that's 30 minutes before legal light to 30 minutes after in that area of Alabama.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it does include that crepuscular period as well. But if they started moving right before that, which I feel like they do a lot of times, then like they kind of miss that. So, all right. Cody, results. What do we got?
All right. Should we start with hunting pressure? You want to get into that for everyone? Because I'm a little newer to hunting. Their numbers, public land averaged about 0.56 hunters per kilometer per day. They couldn't get an hourly rate of hunting hours per hectare.
Matt, you converted these to
miles. So with hunting pressure on public land, it was highest on weekends. So you had about 1.5 hunters per square mile, and then that dropped down pretty significantly or substantially on weekdays to where there was only one hunter every 2 miles. So that's like a 66% drop in the hunting pressure on the public land. And then just real quick on private land, there started off on weekends, you had about 2 hunters per square mile, and that dropped down over 80% to about 1 hunter every 4 miles. So, on private land, there really aren't many hunters going out during the week because they don't really have that need to, and they just go out when they have the time on the weekends.
Yeah.
And the hunting pressure, it was looked at a little bit differently based on the public and private land, because with the private land, you have, you know who's on the land and you know how long they're on the land. But for the public land, they did have an idea of how many people were there, because it was based on, they had like I forget exactly what it was, but you essentially had to have, I think it was permit based for the public land. So you knew how many people had a permit for that area. And so you just looked at the number of hunters that would be in a certain area of that public land per day.
Like check in.
People had to check in, so they knew exactly how many hunters there were, but they just didn't know the hours was what it was.
Gotcha.
So as you can imagine, the greatest hunting pressure was on Saturdays. We should probably mention how many deer were tagged too. 32 deer tagged, 16 bucks, 16 does. And they had tens of thousands of movements that they used to calculate all these things. So there was like a massive data set. Okay, so they split up the results into like daytime periods and nighttime periods. So
and they also split it they looked at it in two different kind of perspectives. A broad perspective, just looking at like weekdays versus weekends. And then they looked at it more finely, looking at individual day effects. Because when they looked at it broadly, they were actually kind of surprised that there weren't really any differences between weekend and weekdays, which is kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. You'd expect there to be, these strong responses during the weekends. But if you think about it, the effect is delayed a little bit. So you have really strong hunting pressure on Saturdays, like Mark was saying. Sundays, you see an effect. And then that effect actually lasts into the week, almost all the way to Wednesday.
Let me pull up this figure. Here's the crazy endless loop of screens. Let me pull up this figure because I think it's really I think it just shows everything in a really clear way.
This one that looks at so this is looking at the different metrics by day of the week. Yeah, that one. Yeah, it's
I mean, it shows really clearly. Friday and Saturday, the deer are moving the most, and Saturday's sort of the peak. Here's the hunting pressure right here. And for those of you that are just listening audio, really encourage you to check out the video podcast, either on Spotify or on YouTube. You can see what we're talking about right here. But yeah, Saturday is the highest pressure on any of these properties. And then it kind of peters off from there. And so when you look at how the deer are moving on Friday and Saturday, they're moving the most, but then on Sunday their movement drops down pretty drastically in response to those that hunting pressure. And this again, like, it kind of makes you wonder, like, how are they figuring this out? How are they figuring out whether they're being hunted or not? It's kind of like an interesting question, and that's something that they kind of discussed as well. And I mean, I don't know, they were saying it's like because there's a population of deer and not every single one of them has encountered a hunter at any given time. So it takes time for the entire population to shift their behavior, which I think is true to some degree. But I also think that they can sense that hunters are around in different ways too. Like, they can smell us. They hear all this activity, like trucks driving around, car doors closing and stuff. And I would definitely assume that at least an older deer would be familiar with that and kind of know what's coming after that. You know what I mean?
Mark, real quick, I just want to explain what this figure is showing too, and just in terms of what the different symbols mean for folks who might not know what what we're looking at here. So the black points in the middle, that's going to be just like what this is the average deer do. So like Mark was saying, we got about 16 bucks and 16 does that were having these collars on them. And so on average, that's what that point is. But obviously, there's going to be some differences among the individuals. And so the bars around those dots represent a lot of that variation, what's going on, with the general population. It's not including everything, but it's going to be, for the most part, the response of these, the deer to these different metrics that we're looking at. So the top one, that's the distance that or the movement rate that they're going. So how far are they moving over these hourly periods? And then the next one was that I think it's total distance. It's a little hard for me to read it. But then the last one was that the probability of activity?
Yeah, probability they're going to move. But what's also really interesting about this is Wednesday, right? Because like you're seeing this peak movement on Saturday, it drops down on Sunday, and then it takes, and on Sunday there's still a good bit of activity, but Monday, Tuesday, there's not. And so it actually takes a few days for them to, be like, oh, maybe it's safe again. Maybe we can start moving again. And then Wednesday, for the first time, they're moving like the same as they were on Saturday, which is pretty interesting if you ask me. I mean, I think there's some implications there for the way that I'm going to hunt for sure. Right. We'll come back to that in a minute.
One other thing I'll just mention that, doesn't really get into the weeds with this paper is, local weather events and how that might change things. If you have a really crummy rainy day, how that might influence deer. If you have in the north, if you have a cold day, that's probably going to get deer moving around a little bit more. So being in Alabama, it's going to be more consistent temperatures, not going to have like those big freezes or anything like that.
Well, that's a good point. You bring that up because I think that's something we could potentially look for some papers for in the future. Is weather patterns of something that I feel like I notice is like moon phases have an effect on the way that deer move. But I also kind of know, like I haven't really looked into it, but I know that scientists have like really struggled to find that link. So I would love to like dive into that a little bit more. Maybe we can do that on a future podcast, but we're going to let people vote on what we're, what papers we're going to pull up for the next one. So, but that's definitely something I'd be wanting to throw into the hopper, as we call it.
Yeah.
That'd be really cool. Should we move to figure 4?
Do you have any more stuff you want to talk about on this, or should we jump to the daytime period?
I think one thing I'll just mention is, it's for folks that can't see it, all 3 of these metrics. So we're talking about movement rate, total distance moved, probability of moving. They're all showing the same trends. So it's, it's really reassuring with scientific papers when you have different ways of looking at data and they all tell the same story. It's just reassuring that, no matter which angle you look at it from, the data is showing you these patterns, which really strengthen the arguments too, that, consistently they're seeing this response from, and this is across all deer, right? So this is all bucks, does, mature and immature.
Yeah.
Should we do it by age next, or talk about that?
I figure we'll just follow the sort of structure of the paper. All right, I'm going to go back to the crazy there. All right, now it's just our faces again. Yeah, so yeah, like I said, they break this down by daytime and nighttime. So just a couple points on each of those, and we can look at the figures here in a minute as well, because I think that summarizes this really well. Like Matt said, they didn't find, for daytime periods, they didn't find any difference between weekend versus weekday, but they have that strong relationship that we just showed for the day of the week.
So then...
And also what I thought was interesting was that the day of the week did not relate to the temporal selection. So they're not choosing to walk during daytime or nighttime on any given day of the week. Like the amount that they like to walk during the day or during the night, like, is not necessarily affected by these factors, the hunting pressure. Like they just kind of have a tendency to either be day walkers or night walkers.
No, that was overall, right? That was across all deer, because there was one way they looked at it that was looking at age. See if age and if sex had any effect on that, which it turns out it does have a strong effect. Where we'll probably get into this in a moment, but I don't know. I thought this was my favorite finding from the paper, so I'm excited to talk about it. But it's like Mark was saying, there wasn't really a response based on, are they more nocturnal or not in response to the hunting pressure? And overall, there wasn't a response. But when you looked more closely at it, when you looked at, whether it was an older deer or younger deer, whether it was a immature, mature deer, whether it was a male or female, for the most part, overall, there was an effect. However, older, smart bucks had an effect. They became nocturnal.
I'll pull up that figure.
Yeah, and like I said, this is my favorite part of the paper because you look at game cameras. All the deer are active at night during the hunting season. All the ones that all the shooter deer, and this really explains why.
I disagree with that statement, but we can get into that.
Well, you're hunting Florida, so I guess you probably hunt a lot of spots.
Well, and so
I put my cameras.
That actually does. You do bring up a good point there, because we do have a lot of predators here that are nocturnal, and so I kind of wonder, and that's actually kind of jumps forward, but one of the papers that I want to suggest that we potentially talk about in the future is looking at the effects that predators have on this exact thing as well. And I do think that Florida is a great example of that because we have so many predators. But that said, you get a lot of pictures of the big bucks at nighttime, but a lot of times I find that that's just because you're putting cameras in places that are like travel corridors, which makes sense. It's like an easy place to get to, and deer are moving through there. But those bucks, a lot of times, are just chilling in their little bedding areas. And if you were to get a camera in there, you'd probably get tons of pictures of them during the day as well.
Yeah. They're still going to be moving around. It's just not moving as much during the day.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off your thought process. Keep going.
No, you're good. But just like the figure here shows, so this is looking at, we've got, let me pull it up on my screen so I can look at this.
I think the most interesting thing here is like when you're looking at the mature deer side of things. I guess both, but like when you look at temporal selection for immature, both male and female, they are pretty close to zero. It's minus 0.1, so they're more likely to walk at nighttime, but barely. And then the probability of activity is pretty high for both of them. The distance or the speed that they're moving at is pretty high for both of them. And there is a difference in the distance that they'll go. The females don't go very far, whereas the immature males will walk a good distance. But then when we switch to the mature ones, well, now both females and males are not moving far. And then when we look at temporal selection, the males are much more likely to move at nighttime, right? So the more negative this number is, the more likely they are, or the more they're selecting for nighttime movement. Then the probability of activity here for daytime, super low for those mature bucks. The distance that they're moving becomes super low, so they're becoming more careful. I would imagine is what that means. So really interesting to see how like the behavior really shifts from like immature to mature deer.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I steal your thunder?
No, you're good. You explained it well. And like you were saying before, it's not that we're saying that the deer aren't moving during the day. It's just that this being the mature bucks, they're just changing how much they move, right? So they're almost 50% of their movement is now going to be at night rather than during the day. And so you're still going to see them during the day, but these are smart deer. They're going to be limited in where they're going to, and they're going to be trying to hide in response to the hunting pressure.
Well, it's more than 50% though, because if you think about this temporal selection, it's zero would be 50-50, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So like it's way down here at like negative 0.6. So I mean, most of the movement for these mature bucks is happening at nighttime.
Yeah.
And so, well, I think that can kind of lead us into like the implications of this information. Like, and what that tells me right there is like, and this isn't, I don't think this is like a secret, but this is really like brings this idea home is like, if you want to kill these mature bucks, like you need to be really close to like their bedding habitat, because they're not moving very fast. So you're not going to catch them very far from that before it's nighttime, if they do decide to move during the day. And, like the distances that they're moving are much smaller. So you just really got to be right on top of them and really figure out where those bedding habitats are. Unless it's the rut, in which case, like, it's crazy. You know?
Right. And, this is in response to rifle season. So we don't know what it would be like if it's, you're out during bow season when it's quiet.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I would be really interested to see what this looks like for bow season, because frankly, that's just when I do most of my hunting. But yeah, I think that kind of like sums up, the research that was done. Do you guys have anything else you want to add on that? Or like, should we talk about like what the implications are of this?
So I'm gonna just do like a real quick overall sense of just like what they found, just main conclusions, just to bring it all home. Whitetails, they do respond to hunting pressure, and they respond to it by, not moving as much, especially during peaks in hunting activity. And this, like the biggest effects were seen by the oldest deer, the wisest deer, especially with those bucks, where they aren't moving around as much, and they're swapping their movement to being more active at night rather than during the day.
Yep, that pretty much sums that up. So what does this mean, like for us? Like, how would you change the way that you hunt based on this information?
I'll chime in on that. I guess as the newest hunter, I was excited about finding this paper because I had it I was trying to come at it with a predation avoidance approach, like biological kind of approach. And I was thinking they'd hunker down, it'd be like an immediate response on the weekend, and then they would really need to get out on Mondays. Like, that was in my head before reading this paper, because they'd need to get food. So I was trying to work through the weekends and get out Monday evenings or Monday mornings was my tactic.
I was wondering why you were doing that.
What'd you say?
I was wondering why you were doing that.
I mean,
theoretically, it makes sense though. It makes sense.
I don't want to work on Mondays.
Yeah. Well, like, so on that note, like, my thought process before I read this paper had always been kind of similar, but rather than like being like, I got to get out on Mondays, like, I always thought I want to get out the latest possible in the week, but before everybody else. Because like in my mind, I was like, that way they have the most time to cool down. And this is kind of showing that there's truth. Like, I always thought Thursday would be like a hot day for me to get out, because it's like before the weekend, they kind of start to learn that human pattern. It's not like they know what day of the week it is, but I feel like they kind of get like there's a rhythm and a cadence to it. So like I feel like they start kind of preparing for the craziness of the weekend and stop moving as much. At least that's what I was thinking. So I was always like, Thursday's the day, but it turns out Wednesday is the day. Yeah. Like, if you want to, like, this is like one of my big takeaways from this. Like, if you get to only hunt for 2 days a week, don't do Saturday and Sunday. Do Saturday and Wednesday.
I will say though, I think it's going to depend on where you are, because where I was hunting in Vermont for the past few years, hunting pressure actually helped me see deer, especially during rifle season, because there's so many hunters in the woods that the hunters are pushing the deer. And so your chances of seeing deer are going to be most probably on like a Saturday, where you have, deer might be moving around a little bit more on their own, but they're also going to be crossing paths with hunters more frequently. So they're going to be getting pushed all around, so that's where, Saturdays were great days to get out in the woods. And even on Sundays, because there are still a lot of people in the woods. And they're going to be pushing deer. But that's, you got to look at density hunters. And if you have really high density hunters, that might be helpful.
That's a really good point, because, well, and it's not just density of hunters, but it's the style of hunting. So like, for instance, like Cody and I, we hunt a spot that's like right here in my backyard. And it's well known for having buggy hunters. And literally people drive buggies like through the woods and like literally do kind of like deer drives. They run their dogs, and like, it's crazy. And so I've always found like during those hunts, like, you just find a good pinch point and set up, and like you'll see deer come running out that probably would have never gotten out of their bed if they hadn't gotten run off. So I guess with that said, this study really kind of shows like the data if you're hunting in an area where like tree stand or still hunting is like the thing to do. If people are doing deer drives, like that is completely out the window. Like all this, they're just going to move when they get bumped, which is all the time. I lost my train of thought. It's gone.
Yeah.
Station. One question I had with this is how much that Saturday movement was inflated by pushing deer, and then I would like to see they mentioned this how hunting pressure then they don't get into how it changes habitat selection. I think that's another sort of strategy I'm trying to use with my hunting is these heavily pressured areas where they can get bumped all the time. They're probably going to be selecting, at least in my mind, as a new hunter, they're going to be selecting those areas that those buggies and that pressure can't reach.
No, you kind of mentioned that like through some text messages where you're like trying to get deep into the cypress where the buggies can't get to. And I definitely think there's something to that. I think you're too early with that thought process, though. I think like later in the season, you're going to really find a lot of deer in those places. I mean, I think there's definitely some research that shows that that's the case. And, maybe we can dive into that on another episode. But I think you're right. I think for the most part, like this is really looking at like a short period of time, but I'm also really curious about like how they respond to hunting pressure over longer periods of time, and whether there's like a long-term trend where their movement starts to decrease over the season, and at the end of the season they're more likely to stay close to those like thick habitats. And I mean, my experience tells me that's probably true, but it'd be really interesting to see if there's data that supports that. But back to the point I was making, if you're only going to hunt 2 days a week, this paper suggests Saturday and Wednesday are the best days to do that. But like you were saying, it really depends on the type of hunting that's happening there and like the type of pressure. But I will also make a point against that argument, because I do believe that if you only spend 1 day in a spot, you might be missing a lot of the activity in that spot, because deer, my experience has been they're not really on like a daily pattern, and that might not be true when you're up in like the Midwest where there's like these giant cornfields and they have this like monoculture of food that they can just move back and forth from their bedding area to that food. But here in Florida, where we don't have that, I find that deer are sort of on like a multi-day pattern. So like you'll have a deer come through like every 3 days, and then you won't see him again for a little while, and then he'll show up on your camera again every 3 days. So if you only spend 1 day in a spot, then you might be missing a lot of the activity that could potentially be happening at that spot. And like I always try and tell myself, like, well, if I didn't see him today, then the chances he's going to show up tomorrow are just that much higher. So, with that said, Saturday and Wednesdays are great for movement, but if you can hunt the whole weekend and hunt Wednesday, you should do that.
Yeah. I think that's, that brings up a good point. You got to know the area that you're hunting. Every area is going to have its own quirks to it. In general, deer will respond to people. How they respond is going to depend on where you are. What's the amount of food that's available? What are the conditions? What's the weather? What's the hunting pressure? So you got to do a little bit more research on your own, but this at least gives us a starting point. We know that deer are going to respond to hunting pressure. We know that it can last longer than we might expect. And the best time to get out in the woods might not be what you think. Like similar to Cody, I would have thought, Monday is a great time to get out. Things are finally quiet Monday, Tuesday, but clearly they've got some memory, and they're gonna react in ways that we might not expect.
And you actually just reminded me of something I did want to bring up. And I think a lot of people in Florida, and I keep talking about Florida because obviously we're in Florida, but a lot of people in Florida are really like the way that FWC manages our hunts, and a lot of people really hate it. And when I say the way they do this, I'm talking about quota hunts. We have a lot of quota hunts that are just a weekend long, and you can't hunt during the week. And the reason they do that is to increase the quality of the hunt for the people that are hunting, so that there's no pressure happening throughout the week. And this paper really suggests that that style of management probably does lead to, a lot more higher quality hunts on those weekends, because the deer are probably going to be moving more because they haven't received any pressure throughout the week. And so that said, like, this paper is like a huge proponent of that quota style of management. And I personally think that, like, I think the way that things are managed here in Florida are really cool and really diverse, and they use different approaches to different pieces of public land. So yeah, I mean, I think I've definitely experienced that this data is true to those areas. So, but I'm curious to hear what people are thinking that are listening to this. Like, drop a comment down below. Let us know, like, if you've seen, these similar patterns in places that you hunt, or if you've seen something completely different, and why you think that might be.
Cool.
So with that said, I think we can wrap it up on this paper. Should we talk about next episode's papers? I'm doing a little creepy raise my eyebrows thing while I say that.
You're excited.
What?
I said you're excited. More good stuff.
I am excited, man. Like, dude, you guys don't understand, like, how long I've been wanting to do something like this, because, like, we're all nerds. Like, I love getting into the data, and like, this gives me an excuse to get into these papers that I've been, like, thinking about for a really long time. So yeah, I'm super excited about this whole thing.
Yeah, we're learning a lot too. Like we're saying, this is going to help us as hunters and anglers, and
and hopefully the people that are listening too.
Yeah.
Crap, I probably should have said right at the beginning of this podcast, like, you guys should hit that little follow button or subscribe button, depending on what platform you're on. But this is a brand new podcast, so please give us a follow. We'd really appreciate it. So let's talk about these papers. All right, Matt, you had a paper you picked out about killing mama does.
Yeah.
Paper. Oh wait, and we should, before we explain this, we want you guys to drop a comment and vote on which one of these 3 papers we're about to pitch to you we should talk about in the next episode. All right, go.
So I've been able to get some doe tags past few years with hunting, and just frequently have had occasions where you got mama doe coming in with a fawn right behind her, and for me, I've always let that doe walk, because just I would feel awful if I shot that doe, and just from like that fawn's perspective, just seeing mama get taken down right in front of her or him, and not sure what would happen with that fawn afterwards. And so I just wanted to know, like, what does research show happens to fawns that have lost their mother during the hunting season? And so there's a few papers that come out. They're older papers back from like the 80s, but they look at things like survival rates, the size of the deer, and like how likely the deer is to move around. But then also things like, are the deer going to be are they more likely to mate with a buck that year? So looking at all these different parameters, all these different factors, and how the fawns respond to having their mom lost. Spoiler alert, survival rates don't seem to drop. So if you're in a need for meat, or if you would just want to get the doe, the fawn should be all right.
Dude, no spoiler alerts, man. We gotta save.
Well, there's some other really interesting things that go on. So I think it is still it's interesting to learn.
Didn't they make a movie out of that? Isn't that what Bambi's about?
I mean, yeah, you're right.
Bambi grew up to be a really nice buck.
In a nutshell, like, this paper is about how truthful was Bambi.
Yeah.
That could be the name of the podcast if this is the paper we end up picking.
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested in this topic though, because I'll say one time I shot a doe and I didn't know there was a fawn with her. And that was like one of the most gut-wrenching things ever, man, because I shot the doe, she ran into the bushes, and then like 10 seconds later, this little Bambi, I mean, I don't think it had spots on it. Like, I think it was like a yearling, but this little tiny deer comes in and like literally goes into the bushes, and like, Mom,
Yeah.
you need to get back up. And I was just like, oh man, I feel freaking terrible.
That's funny. You know what? I don't need the meat that bad. We'll let that deer walk.
Yeah, I mean it definitely felt pretty crappy, but so maybe this paper will make me feel a little bit better about that interaction. All right, Cody, which paper are you pitching?
All right, I'm gonna push kind of my comments about I'd like to look at now the fine scale habitat selection aspect of predator avoidance. Again, with hunters as our predators, they're humans. So this one's in Mississippi. They do radio collars again, or GPS collars, sorry. And
who's the author of this paper?
This is out of the MSU Deer Lab, I believe.
Well, who's the main author?
Henderson.
Colby?
Yep.
Yeah, I know Colby.
It looks like a cool paper, but they map the vegetation types in this area and then relate it to movements during hunting season. So maybe I'll just brief like that.
Okay, and I'll make my pitch. So I kind of alluded to this throughout this podcast a little bit. We've looked at people and how hunters affect deer movement when we're applying pressure during the day. But I always wonder, what about putting pressure on them at night by nocturnal predators? And so a paper I have picked out is looking at an apex predator that primarily hunts at nighttime and how that affects the movements of target species. It includes deer, hogs, bear, and turkeys in this paper. There's a bunch of different species that they're looking at. And I've always kind of wondered, is having these predators on the land a good thing for hunting because it keeps deer moving during the day more, or is it bad because they reduce the population? So those are the questions that I was thinking about when I started looking for this paper. And that's the one that I would like to dive into. So with that said, think about those three papers. We got shooting mama does. What happens to the fawn? When you pressure deer, do they change the way that they use different habitat types? And how do nocturnal predators affect the movement of deer and other game species? Drop a comment down below. Let us know which ones you guys want us to dive into. And we will catch you guys in the next episode. And do us a little favor. Tell your friends about this podcast. Like I said, it's brand new. And we need to get the word out there. We're going to be doing this every 2 weeks for the time being. Who knows, maybe we'll ramp it up in the future. But we appreciate y'all for listening. Do you guys have any last words?
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and buy Matt's sweaty man posters.
Yeah, they're great.
All right, y'all.
Become a sweaty hunter yourself.
We'll catch you guys in the next one.